And we are live. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to She Built It, Boss Lady Chronicles. I am Sharita Gaskins Tillett. I am your host, and this is the show where we highlight ordinary women who are doing extraordinary things, women who have owned their power to transform their lives. And I am super excited about tonight's guest. But before I introduce her, I just want you to say hello in the comments. If you're watching the replay, hashtag replay. I just want to give a few minutes for other folks to log on. I do have an announcement. We have launched our accountability group, Boss Ladies Building Dreams Accountability Group. And you might remember earlier in the year, we did goal setting. And so this is the time where we kind of roll up our sleeves and start implementing those goals, start actually bringing them to reality. Because it's one thing to write a goal and to have a goal, but it's quite another to accomplish it. And I want you guys to meet all of your goals. So if you want more information, reach out to me by DM. You can check us out in the Boss Lady Dream Builders Facebook group. But definitely consider joining the accountability group because it is going to be huge. All right, so I am going to introduce tonight's guest. Like I said, super excited to share her with you. So this tonight we have Maria Costanzo Palmer, who was named as LA Weekly's one of the top 15 rising authors in 2023 for On the Rocks. Maria's writing has also been recently recognized by Governor Phil Murphy, who sent her a personal commendation letter after her Page Turner nomination. On the Rocks has been covered heavily in the media, including most recently mentioned in Forbes Magazine. She is also the founder of the popular Facebook Instagram fans page at Joe Costanzo Prima Donna, which hosts 100,000 visitors a month, seeking recipes, Italian memes, giveaways, and a peek at her day-to-day life working in the family restaurant business for many years. In addition, Maria is a well-known force in the nonprofit world. She has worked on both coasts for organizations that give voice and equity to the marginalized members of society. She has been covered widely in the media. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Sharita. It is so good to be here with you and with your audience. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on board tonight.
Well, thank you for coming and sharing your story. And I was telling Maria just before we came on camera that I don't feel her bio does her justice at all. I might have to rewrite her bio later on.
You are too sweet. Coming from you, that means the world, honestly. I love your story and, how you came into doing this. It's awesome. So excited to be here with you.
Thank you. Well, let's kind of jump right in. I think I'm going to have you tell your story where you want to begin. And I
Sure.
know, a fair amount of the story. And so I will ask questions as they come up. But why don't you tell us your story?
Absolutely. So I guess my story starts in a small little suburb outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, which probably nobody's ever really heard of until last year, whenever the Buffalo Bills star Damar Hamlin had a cardiac arrest on the field. And he is, in fact, from McKees Rocks, and his mother's daycare, which now I think he's raised close to $9 or $10 million for, shares a back alleyway with a building that's a little special to me. So, growing up, my father left his very comfortable postal job and bought a failing business in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, which is not an area that's known for popularized restaurants. And he turned it into one of America's hot spots in the 80s through the early 2000s. And it was a very magical childhood. I always say, kids, I have lots of nieces and nephews. I have kids of my own that are kind of now aging out of this, but they love to play with plastic, right? Those plastic kitchens, toys. I had a real life kitchen. So I served my Barbie dolls at the bar rail. I, put my teddy bears at a booth and pretended like I was playing on the computer because we actually had a point of sale system, which was really big, especially back in
Yeah,
the 80s,
yeah.
whenever computers were not really commonplace. So my childhood was very magical, and the one thing that I did miss is my dad was always working, and he was always very busy. So eventually, I learned, like many of us probably do if you grew up in a family business, the way to see your family is you gotta work in the business.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Yes.
I started working in the restaurant business whenever I was in high school, just being a bus person and doing little odd jobs here and there, and then eventually, worked there very steadily throughout college, which was a nice supplement, going to school, and became very close, and learned a lot of really valuable life lessons. And we were so busy during that time, lots of celebrities and sports stars and you name it, broadcasters, people who would just be coming into Pittsburgh to visit for one reason or another would show up at our doorstep. And a city that didn't have too much going on after the industrial boom had limos lining the streets and people waiting in line to eat. And then one day that all changed because I got a knock at my door, and it was the federal government, and they were looking
Wow.
for my father, and his name was mentioned in a federal grand jury investigation, which at the time meant that whatever he was accused of doing, or maybe not even accused of doing, it was a criminal case and not a civil case. So at that moment, because somebody had mentioned his name in this federal grand jury investigation as part of them not getting in trouble, as they said that he was a person of interest, our life changed very, very drastically. And we went from, I want to say, the top of the world to kind of the bottom, you know,
Wow.
very quickly, almost overnight. And it was very, very hard for me because I was only 20 years old whenever this all came down. And I really had a hard time mentally wrapping my head around what was happening, and also coming to grips with things that were very unknown and very scary to me.
Sure.
I had never expected somebody in my family to be incarcerated, which
Right.
eventually
Right.
my father was. After the investigation, he pled guilty to tax evasion charges and served some time in federal prison. And that in itself really threw me for a loop. Mentally, it put me on a different trajectory, and I started to experience a lot of depression, panic attacks. I had a lot of trouble even just making basic decisions, like going to a restaurant and having a whole menu of options and then specials on top of that. It was just too much for me. I could barely put one foot in front of the other, let alone make a decision or a choice about something.
Yes.
And so that became a very, very hard part of my early adulthood. And it really took me meeting this random chance meeting this like gambling, loud, fashionista Catholic nun. I'm a former Catholic person myself. But she defied everything that I knew about what it meant to be a nun. And she was a rule breaker and a change maker. And she's still rocking it at like 75. She just opened up a new nonprofit, helping marginalized people at the border. So she's still just like kicking butt. But it really took her and her insight. She had started an organization bringing children in California to visit their incarcerated parents. And I was so touched. I went to a presentation where she was talking about this, and I was so touched by the stories and by what she did that it took me getting involved with her and going and fundraising for the organization for me to start to heal. And, that is, I would say, one of the central messages about who I am. And I know that we've talked about this before, Sharita, is, you cannot change your life or your
No.
path or your
No.
destiny, but you have the ability to pick your own pen up and tell your own story and you trudge through that heavy mud and quicksand, and guess what? One day, it's gonna get better. It's
Yes.
gonna end up working out. You don't know how it is. I mean, how can life get so much better whenever your father goes to prison, right?
Right.
But it
Yeah.
does. And, you can get through hard things. So that's, I think, one of the central messages, not only of the book, but also just of who I have become. It's taken me 40 some years to get here, but
Yeah.
finally learned
Yeah.
these lessons.
So I want to kind of go back a little bit because I know when we talked before, you kind of characterized your life as the before times and the after times. And so I want to go back to the before times, and I'm curious because you said it kind of changed the whole trajectory of your life. What had you planned for your life before all of this happened, before your dad was incarcerated?
I don't think I really had a solid, passion per se. I, as a young child, obviously my parents struggled because they opened their own business, and my mom pretty much was staying at home with us. She had left her very comfortable income working at the airlines, and then sort of helped my dad get his business off the ground. And my dad left his steady postal worker job, and then as things got better and the restaurant became successful and they were busier, I would say, with us, we started to get more and more comfortable, right? With
Yeah,
things
yeah,
that, you take for granted that maybe some people don't have, right?
sure.
And so I didn't really, I mean, I had some ideas of things that I thought I might wanna do, but I really didn't have that purpose that was looking me straight in the eye and that was saying, "This is why you were put on this earth, Maria." It was more, what do? You go to
Yeah,
college and then you find a job. But, it was checking off the boxes,
yeah,
not creating the things that I needed to create to be more whole, if that makes sense.
it
So,
does. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's not not an uncommon kind of perspective. Yeah, I always call education a series, early education, meaning college, and maybe even grad school to some extent, a series of uninformed decisions.
yeah,
Because
it's
you're
true.
young,
Yeah,
you don't know very much about the world, even if though we probably thought we did at the time.
sure.
You
Yeah,
don't know very much about the world, but you're having to make these decisions about the direction in which you're going to take your life.
that's
And
true.
you're obligated financially, and investing your time and all of those things, and you're not sure at all if that's really where you're trying to go.
Yeah, and I felt that a lot. I would say that especially during those times, I almost felt that I was floundering, right? Like I
Yeah,
was making decisions, but I was choosing things because they were either presented to me, like you have to go this path or this path. Okay, I guess I'll go this path. Or I was just playing the motions. And that really happened until I was able to pave my life's purpose, which for me is a service rooted life. That, in addition to being an author, I really have a passion for serving very marginalized communities and groups of people and finding ways to bring resources into places that there aren't many. That to me makes me go to sleep very well at night.
yeah,
Um, it makes me happy to see that, the money that I'm able to get through writing grants for organizations is really making an impact, especially on our youth.
yeah,
And it obviously I don't make a lot of money, but the money that I do make, it just it's well earned, and it makes me very happy to know that it's done a lot of good.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's amazing. And you mentioned before about meeting the nun. Now one part that you didn't share here tonight was that you actually moved 3,000 miles away from Pittsburgh, right?
Yes,
When all of this
I
happened.
did, because I always tell people, if you have a lot of problems in your life, the best thing that you can do is you hop on a plane because your problems, they just won't follow you, right? They're not
Yes,
like
enough
carry-on
of that.
baggage. You land and then you forget, which obviously that doesn't happen. But yeah,
Sure.
I moved, because I needed a fresh start. The case was very popular, very public in, the area that I was living, and I needed to get away from that, and
Yeah,
I
sure.
needed to kind of separate my own identity. I think being 20 years old, even if there's nothing going on per se, like if your, life is pretty status quo, it's still hard to be a young person because
Oh,
you're,
absolutely.
you know, in a way separating from your traditional family with your parents, and you're trying to find your purpose, trying to find a job, trying to, create your own communities
Sure.
and have a little bit of independence. And I think that that's very tough. But whenever you throw an existential crisis and
Right. Right. Right.
everything that my family and I had been through during that time, that made that time, even I think that the more challenging to have to overcome.
So remind me how you met the nun.
Yeah,
Because
so
I think this is really an interesting thing, as the child of someone incarcerated. How did you come to meet this nun who was doing that kind of work?
totally circumstantial almost. So we had just moved to LA, and I say we collectively because it was my boyfriend at the time who eventually became my husband and still is my husband today. And he had moved, and I had followed him because he wanted to work in the Hollywood industry. And we were searching for a church out there, and he grew up Episcopalian, I grew up Catholic. Was having some basic, fundamental issues with what was going on at the church at the time. And, I thought, okay, well, Episcopalian's basically the same. It's like Catholic light. I can do that.
Yeah.
Um, and he had started going to church in Beverly Hills, and, I'm not a girl that's from Beverly Hills. So I said, I don't think God lives in Beverly Hills, right? Like I
Don't say
said,
that.
at the time, I think Winona Ryder had just gotten caught for shoplifting on Rodeo Drive. And like, there was just a lot of stuff. And, the people that you see, I'm like, these are not godly people that I'm running into here. Like, I don't think that God lives here in Beverly Hills, but it's this amazing Episcopalian church that I'm sure is still there, called All Saints Beverly Hills. And it had a very good reputation. It was a bunch of East Coast people that actually ran the church.
Hmm.
One woman that was in charge was one of the first women that was allowed to be ordained.
Oh, wow.
So she certainly had been through her own pieces of adversity, kind of breaking out of a man's world and becoming one of the first women that was actually allowed to lead a church. And the cool thing about this church, there's a lot of very cool things, but it had different programs and lots of focus on service and outreach. And so my husband thought, this is where he could tie me in because he knew
Yeah.
that service was always at my core. And so this nun, Sister Suzanne Jabro, was coming to do a presentation about her program, Get on the Bus, at All Saints Beverly Hills. And so the deal was, I mean, at that time, I was not in a good place at all. And I think that, my boyfriend, now husband, was just so desperate to see me get back on track to something.
Yeah.
He just was presenting options, and he said, I think you would really like this presentation. This nun is coming. She's talking about a program that she started for children with incarcerated parents. I think this is going to speak volumes to you. I think you should go. And then I rebutted back and I said, I don't want to go. I don't know these people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I really don't want the first thing these people to know about me is that my dad's in prison. I just don't,
Yeah.
especially in the
Yeah.
middle of Beverly Hills where this is not commonplace. I really don't
Right.
want to go there and expose
I
myself.
mean, and let's face it, you left Pittsburgh so that you didn't have to live in the shadow of that, right?
Exactly. So I'm like, I don't really want to go back and do that. But we made a deal and he said, all right, well, I will. Because for me, there are two things that I'm not spectacular at. And I always admit it. The first is technology. People always ask me, do you get nervous whenever you get on interviews? And I say, yes, but not for the same reason that you think I am. Once I get talking with somebody, I'm fine. When I have to open up my computer, see if my microphone works, get connected to StreamYards and Zooming, and I'm not so fine there.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
very nervous. But once I see someone's face and I say, can you hear me? Can you see me? And they say
Yeah.
yes and yes, then I'm good. So technology is not a big thing that I love. And I can't even think of the second thing that I don't love that much. Oh, driving is also not something that directions is not something that I'm great at either. So my husband knew this and he said, I will take you to this presentation. I'm going to drop you off at the front. Just go in, listen to this nun speak, and then whenever it's done, I'll be waiting outside. You come out and that's it. You don't have to talk to anybody. And I didn't know anybody at the church because we had only been there a couple of times and it was such a
Right.
large church. I was able to come in. I think I brought a book, came in, 5 minutes before the presentation, sat down in the back, pretended like I was distracted, didn't say hi to anybody. No one said hi to me because they didn't know me.
Sure.
And all of a sudden, I'm looking around for the habit, right? Like, where is this nun? Because East Coast nuns,
Right.
they're a whole different game. You know what I mean? Like
Yes, I do.
they roll in, they got the habit, they got, I mean, it's Sister Act. That's the kind of situation you're looking at,
Easily
right? Or
identified. Right.
or what is it? The Hills Are Alive, The Sound of Music, like that whole
Yes.
that whole situation that was not occurring. So there was this one person that was in the room that everyone seemed to know. But she was loud and very boisterous. And I just remember her whole outfit was coordinated from head to toe, jewelry, nails, toes, wedge, peak toe shoes,
Oh, wow.
just very like suave. And she knew everybody. So I just figured this has got to be the head of this, outreach organization that was bringing this nun, and the nun's late. And then all of a sudden, the presentation time starts, and this person kind of pops up and starts talking and introduces herself as Sister Suzanne. And I'm like, okay, this
What kind
sister
of
and
nun
this
is this?
sister that I
Right.
was expecting, they don't match. There's something wrong here. And, what I could tell instantly is that she had such a passion for what it was that she was doing. And it started out not with the children. She started out visiting the women in prison and figuring out, having conversations with them. She would call them crossovers. So she would bring, I think it started with just her and a couple of other nuns. And then they started to match. If there were 50 women in the inside they were going to be talking to, she brought in 50 women from the
Mm,
outside
okay.
and tried to match similar ages and talk about women's issues. And,
Yeah.
these are the problems that are occurring both inside and outside. How do we from the outside help you from the inside? And it became very powerful. And she really wanted to start doing this regularly with the delegation of women, visiting the women in Chowchilla women's prisons, which is about a 5 hour without traffic and 8 hour probably with traffic drive from Los Angeles, which is where a lot of the
Wow.
families come from. And so these women said, well, why would these strangers visit us if we never see our own children? And so she went around the room and asked these women, how long has it been since you've seen your children? And they had said between 7 and 14 years they
Wow.
hadn't seen their children. And so she said, I knew at that point there was going to be a bus,
Yeah, that
but
the mission had to change.
yes. And, there were going to be kids on this bus, and I just wasn't going to take no for an answer. And so she brought that first bus of 50 people, which I think were 17 children on that bus, and caregivers coming to the child trailer women's prisons. And what she found was remarkable. People went back to, even though their kids were now, some of them in their 20s, people reverted back to the last time they had seen their children. And
Yeah,
as mothers, as many females can relate, even if you aren't an actual mother, you probably have a niece, nephew, somebody
sure.
special, grandchild, stepchild, whatever it might be, that's in your corner. Um, but the women in prison for that day were not women in prison. They were mothers. And
Yeah,
she just saw what an impact this organization made, and she decided to just continue on with it, and then eventually opened up a Father's Day. Ended up getting some state funding, so they did a monthly visit with less frills than what Get on the Bus had. But I was so moved by what it was that she was doing and what it was that she was saying, that as she was talking, it actually, for the first time, gave me this reality check.
mm,
Because up until that point, here's how my thought process was. It was very much, woe is me. Why
yeah,
did this happen to me? This is so unfair. I don't know anybody else that this has ever happened to. I, can't believe that my dad was this pillar in my community, and now, he's off serving time in a federal facility, and it's very hard on our family, and it's embarrassing, and it's awful, and we've sort of lost everything that he built, right? Whenever you see kids who are 3 and 4 years old and they're being raised by their grandparents, and there are multiple families sometimes sharing small apartments, and they are struggling just to have enough coins to be able to split
yeah,
something in the overpriced vending machine, that checks you, and that stops you from saying, woe is me. And that
right.
gets you on a different path and saying, wow, how lucky and how blessed I was that, in my childhood, I didn't go through this. I had my dad, I had access to him. Um, I wasn't in this position. How lucky was I? So, it's all in your perspective, right? The same
Yes,
thing can be happening to you, and you can view it in one way, and then you flip your perspective a little bit and it's something
right.
totally different. And I think, that was one of the gifts, one of the many gifts that Get on the Bus gave to me. It allowed me to share my story with people. It allowed me to be able to be a conduit to bring children to see their parents in prison, and reunite families together. Um, but it
So
also
you
allowed me to
eventually you
heal.
eventually became the director of Get on the Bus, right?
I did, yeah, and, totally, again, happenstance situation. I started just by, volunteering and fundraising for them, and I did it because, as Sister Susanna would always tell me, she said, "Maria, I can take you to Pasadena, I can take you to Beverly Hills, and you can talk, and people aren't intimidated by you."
Mm,
But she said, "I could also take you to South Central, and people also love you, and they can relate to you." So she said, "You are probably my most versatile tool, because
mm,
you just go and you're your authentic you always." And, I was so glad to be that for her because her organization obviously was grassroots, very decentralized, and she needed
Yes.
funding, to be able to put on these awesome programs. So one day we were going, I think, to speak in Pasadena, and we had stopped to get gas. And very calmly, she had told me she'd hired a director who I thought was an amazing candidate for the job. When she was a child, she actually used Get on the Bus services to go and see
Okay.
her mother in Chowchilla Women's Prison. But it just didn't, it just wasn't a match. And so she was hired and maybe worked for 4 or 5 months and then just decided that that was it. But she quit at the height of the time where there was supposed to be a big statewide volunteer training. So it was
Mhm.
not great timing.
Right.
And I, was saying to Suzanne, like, what are you going to do? Aren't you nervous? Like who's going to, because she was serving as the executive director, looking over not only just Get on the Bus, but a couple of other programs that we had. And she said, no, I'm not nervous. I have somebody in mind for this job. And I said, oh, that's really fantastic. And I said, oh, do I know the person? Yep, you do. I said, oh, well, who is it? She goes, it's you. And I said, oh, no, 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 it's not me. You can't hire me. It's not going to work. And she said, well, why not? And I said, well, first of all, I'm young. I'm just out of college. I cannot do this. And she said, well, okay, I'm not buying that. I think you have all the skills that you need to do this and it'll be easy and I can help you. Like, why else can't you do this? And I said, well, I've never really run an organization. And she said, again, these are all things that you can
Yes.
easily
Yes.
learn and adapt. And it was just, I had to look it in the face and I had to listen to what it was that she was saying because the confidence that she had in me and she still has in me to this day, she reminds me, honestly, the female version of my dad. Really, they have a
Yeah.
very similar personality, very, very similar to one another. But the amount of confidence that she had in me, I could not see in myself at that time. But I, tried to be respectful and take in what it was
Sure.
that she was seeing, but I really did not believe that I was the person to do the job when I took the job.
So did you think that, or in hindsight, I guess, did you find that taking that job, working with those kids helped to heal you?
Oh my, yes. I think that if there was one piece of the puzzle that became the I know you're a former MD here, so you'll get it, like the quick fix treatment or medication. It was this. I thought whenever I went into this job, I thought that I was going to be the one that was going to help all these people.
Yeah.
And really, that is not at all what happened. What happened was the families that I was there to serve ended up being of service to me. And
Mm,
they ended up teaching me things that I didn't even know I was signed up to learn at the
yeah.
time.
Yeah.
They taught me about how to be resilient and how to deal with life whenever you just keep on getting thrown a bunch of lemons and you gotta work it out, and also how to laugh again.
Yeah.
Such a big part of my childhood. I grew up big Italian family. Everybody's boisterous, screaming across the table. It's all in good fun. We're pulling each other's chains. Like it's just how we sort of worked whenever we were growing up, right? And when something traumatic happens to you, a lot of times you lose that ability to emote,
Yes.
right? Like I stopped crying. I'm a very sensitive person and I just stopped crying. I don't know, the tears just never came out during that time. I also stopped laughing. I'll see something funny and if anything, it just sort of annoyed me or I
Mhm.
would just turn the other way. I just couldn't I took myself way too seriously because I thought, "Okay, I'm dealing with something very serious and very heavy, and this has to be who I am from now on until
Mm,
the day that I die, like, I have to
right.
carry this burden." And really, once I started laughing again and started being silly and started to not take myself so seriously, that's whenever the pieces of myself that I felt kind of fell away during that time, they started to come back and say, "All right, I'm still here.
Yeah.
You know, I'm
Right,
alive. I
right.
might have been sleeping for a little bit, but, I'm coming back and I'm coming back stronger." So
So tell me, I want to switch gears a little bit because On the Rocks is right there in front of us.
yeah.
Tell us a little bit about On the Rocks, and I want to know, what inspired you to write this book.
So this book actually started out as a family history. So the book is really the story of my father. So it is his rise to success in the restaurant industry through his sharp fall, which includes his time in prison, and what the learnings were, what the takeaways were after that. And whenever I first started writing this piece, I noticed that once the restaurant had gone away from our family, there was also a part of my dad that had sort of died as well.
Mm,
And, one of the very beautiful things about having a lot of interaction at a restaurant or owning a restaurant is that you get to be part of people's lives in
yeah,
ways that you just don't have access to normally. Like, if you get a promotion at work or a graduation or a birth, right? You celebrate
right.
in the company of those that you love, many times around a table with food.
Yes, yes.
And so we got to be privy to so many wonderful moments. I mean, engagements,
Mm,
weddings, rehearsal dinners, baptisms, you name it. And even the tough moments, even funerals and wakes and those types of things. We got to have the honor of celebrating those wonderful people and their families entrusting us in that final celebration. So losing the restaurant to my dad, who's also an incredibly gregarious person, was a tough blow.
mhm,
There was nothing worse, and I could see that he was fading away, and
mhm.
so I asked him questions like, "Dad, tell me about a time where something really funny happened at the restaurant,"
Okay.
or tell me about a time where there was a bar fight, or tell me about a time when a really famous celebrity came in unexpectedly. And I had one of those old-fashioned tape decks, and I would just press play and record at the same
Yeah.
time and just let them go. And so the beginnings of this were just transcriptions of the stories that he was telling. And I started to realize as a writer, because I've always worked in the nonprofit industry, but I've always worked as a writer. But I started to realize that those stories were a great piece of my family history, but it was also a history that other people and
Yeah.
other families from all over would be interested in. And so I was able to partner with my lovely writing partner, Ruthie Dines Robbins, who was also my AP English teacher and my teacher throughout school. And we have so many 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. She actually grew up right on the same street that the restaurant sat.
Oh, wow.
She was one of my father's first customers when he was doing 10 dinners a night. She and my father are the exact age, almost to the date. My father turned 70 in 2023, August the 3rd, and Ruthie turned 70 in 2023, August the 13th. So they are, in fact, 10 days apart. So very similar upbringings as far as their generation, and what they experienced within that generation, and also what the city of McKees Rocks was like back in the 50s and 60s,
Yeah.
which was, well before my time. I sort of had only known it when it was not a place to drive through and
Yeah.
stop, right? It was
Yeah.
a place that you kept on driving. You didn't want to stop.
Yes.
But she and I had always kept in touch, even after high school and even after college, because her oldest son and I were very good friends. And so she had known that I was writing this book, and she asked to bring it she was working with a writers group in Buffalo, New York,
Okay.
editing books. And she asked to bring some of the pieces to that writing group. And they agreed on two things. Number one, that the book needed a lot of work, which I knew. And number two, that the book had a lot of commercial potential, which I also knew. And it was really from that point on that we had decided that we were not going to be editor and writer, but we were actually going to be co-writers on this
Okay.
project. And we worked very hard. She sped the process along. I worked on this for 10 years myself, and then an additional 7 with her. So
Wow.
I always say, hey,
Talk about a labor of love.
exactly. I always tell Ruthie, I said, once you came aboard, we were flying. I just did a assembly for the 5th graders in my town 2 weeks ago. And they said, how long does it take to write a book? And I said, does it take to write a book, or does it take to write my book? Because
Right.
they're very different things. You can write a book, especially if you use AI, in an hour if you want to. But my book took 17 years. And, there were a lot of pieces to that. And I think a lot of because it was my family story, to be sensitive to get it right. And
Right.
also, it's easy to tell all of the great things about ourselves. But as writers, what makes a writer interesting is not that you're just telling all the great and wonderful things. It's that you're willing to tell some of the things that aren't so
Yes.
wonderful, and some of the things that make the duality of a human being, and that give us that piece of humanity that makes others want to relate to who it is that we are.
Yes.
That's hard to do. It's
It
really
is.
hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you had to characterize the book in one word, what would that word be?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, I would say,
Or maybe not one word, maybe like a story of in that one word.
yeah. I mean, I guess if I had to do one word, I would say it's a very heartwarming book.
Okay.
If I had a couple more words, I I'm a writer that writes for people who don't like to read.
Okay.
So for a lot of people, they've actually told me this is the first book that I've ever read cover to cover.
Yeah.
Um, and the reason that I like to write for people who don't necessarily like to read, and people that like to read also love this book.
Mhm.
Actually, a former New York Times journalist just read this book and actually emailed me an hour before I got on with you today and said how much he enjoyed it, because it's
That's
such a
awesome.
fast read. But the thing that my writing partner and I really wanted is, we wanted it to be very uplifting. We wanted it to be fast, to be very action packed, and to not drag on. So all of the chapters are between 3 to 5 pages.
Oh, wow.
So it's very fast. And, I don't know if you're a night reader at all, but I read a lot of times before I go to bed. And one of the worst things, right, is, you're reading, especially if you have a hardcover, right? You're reading this book, and then all of a sudden, if you're like me, right, you start dozing off,
Right.
and then the book like falls on your head or on your glasses, and it hurts, right? So
Yes.
I always tell people, this is a very low risk for being
For injury.
yeah, for being injured during reading, because if you can only read 3 pages, that's an entire chapter for the most part. Some of our chapters are slightly longer than that, but, very action-packed, uh, very unpredictable, I would say.
Mhm.
We got almost everything that could possibly happen, as far as, like, high stakes, high drama. Um, but it's also very funny too. Like, there are parts and characters that you will just grow to love
Yeah.
even when they're not so nice. They're
Mm.
they're
Okay.
endearing.
So I do have a question just about your relationship with your dad, because just in talking with you, you guys seem pretty close now and as though the relationship is like it was before.
Yeah.
Was there a time where there was a lot of tension, after the incarceration and that you had to rebuild to get back to where you are?
Not really.
Okay.
I think that the hardest part for me was feeling so much anger that this all happened to us, especially because it wasn't like my dad was a person of the government's interest necessarily. He was a person who was mentioned in
Mhm.
somebody else's investigation, which made him a person of interest. So
Sure.
for a lot of time, I did harbor some hard feelings for that individual that
Mhm.
kind of said something about my dad. I don't anymore at all. I don't know if it's just all the yoga that I've done or what it might be, but um, I can empathize with that person. I think that it had to have been a scary time for them.
Sure. Sure.
They may have been fearful of the unknown, including, a potential prison sentence and a felony. And my dad was very low hanging fruit. He was very successful in a very unlikely location. This is not a place that you go to make it big. And he
Right.
just happened to. And so I can understand now that there may have been a little jealousy involved, but for the most part, it was probably this is low hanging fruit and probably a get out of jail free card.
Sure.
And to I always tell my dad that the prison piece, although it was hard and we definitely never want to go through it again, and I hope that nobody who's listening ever has to go through it, you don't get this without that.
About that. Yeah.
Nobody is going to pick up this book if it just says, and then we won this, and then this amazing person came in, and then we did this. No, people want to see some really rough parts of what can happen. And, the book, I would say, has a very equal balance of that. And my dad today is really doing amazingly. He had a lot of, I think I shared with you before, lots of health challenges over the past at least 5 or 10 years. And, he's still dealing with that. He's a 2-time kidney transplant patient, open heart surgery, major back surgery, quite recently he had to have some blockages repaired vascularly on his legs, and lots of challenges that stem from diabetes basically. Um, but the one amazing thing is that he's able to wake up now and be alive for this. Like,
Yes.
there's nothing more that he loves than going out on the road or doing a media interview. And that, I always tell people, if this book doesn't sell one more copy, it will be so successful in my mind because it's the memories that I've created with him that
Right.
are always going to be here. And we're just having so
Priceless.
much fun. So
So,
much
you know,
fun.
you talk about the book and how it speaks to people and all those things, but you share with me that this book was almost not published, right?
Yeah.
So, so you
Yeah.
talked about resilience before. Tell us that story of resilience where this book is concerned.
Oh my gosh. So I always say this is an underdog story and it's an underdog book. So the publishing process is very interesting. I knew nothing about it before I got into it. I've kind of, learned trial by fire basically. Whenever we finished this book, it was in the summer of 2020, whenever the pandemic was going on, and everybody, their brother, sister, famous aunt, uncle, musician friend, reality star, cousin, they all wrote books. And so the worst category that you could write in is my category because you're competing with all of these incredibly famous people. And not only are you competing with incredibly famous people, but you're also in the narrative nonfiction category. They're not just looking for a famous person, but they're also looking for really well written pieces. So you have to
Yeah.
write like a fiction writer, but also have this huge platform of followers. And we didn't have that type of pool. So from the start of this, I would say, had that disadvantage to us. We were not a household name. My dad's restaurant had been closed for 20 years. And, people said, well, why now? Why do people need to hear about this? This is a regional story at best. It cannot compete on the shelf next to Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential, next to Stanley Tucci's Taste.
Mhm.
We're going to pass. And it took a very long time. I finally met my agent. We finished this in the summer of 2020. I met my agent in the winter of 2021. We signed a contract in the summer of 2021. And then we went on and in the agent process, I had submitted to 265 agents. Out of the
Wow.
265 agents, which I told the 5th grade class that I was speaking to, only had the entire school had 200 people in it. So I said,
Wow.
imagine you ask, something of all of the kids in the school
And they all
and
say no.
and they all say no. Plus the class above you and the class below you are also saying no. That's not even in your school, right? All your teachers. So,
Yeah.
um, I had 140 people completely ghost me. About 100 said thanks, but no thanks. 17 said, okay, I'll see a bit more. And only one person signed us. And then whenever it was time to go on submission, we went on submission to publishers in the fall of 2021. They say in submission, and it's probably changed now because the process is so slow and backed up. But at that time, they were saying if you've been on submission for 6 months, your book is dead, right? We approached the 6-month mark and actually went past that. So we had basically lots of close passes, but no takers, all the way up to we were approaching a year. And you also have to understand at that time, my dad was very ill. He was on
Mm.
dialysis. He was not doing well. And the thing that kept him alive was knowing that this book might come
Yes.
out. And he would ask me all the time, so what's going on with the book? Has anybody taken it? Is there any interest? And it was heartbreaking for me to not be able to give him a positive answer or not even a guess as to, yeah, I think, somebody might take it. I mean, really, we had no hope for this book. Just about everybody had passed on it. Um, Ironically, I was back in Pittsburgh in August of 2022. And I was with my youngest daughter, and we were there for not even a day, and both my parents came down with COVID.
Oh,
So we left, and nobody wanted us back. So we ended up, I think, in Hershey, PA. We went to the Hershey Park.
yeah.
We were riding roller coasters, got home from a long day, and I checked my email, and I had an email from Cooler Publishing. And I thought it was a hoax, after all
I
this
guess
time of
so. Yeah.
trying. And, they said they were interested in On the Rocks. And I called my agent. And she said, okay, I'm going to check into it. She checks into it. She said, it's not a hoax. They are interested. They want to talk. So I got on a call with them, and they were very interested, and they ended up taking on the book that nobody else believed in. And the book was set for publication of August of 2023. The book went on pre-order in March because we were able to establish a amazing partnership with the Heinz History Center of Pittsburgh, which is America's #1 history center at the moment. But it's a Smithsonian Museum affiliate. And that's where we had our launch party. But they pre-sold the book for us. And they had our invite-only 500-person launch party 2 days before the release. And when the book came out, for 2 weeks, it led Amazon as the #1 culinary memoir. And #2 was Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential.
With whom you could not compete, right?
Who I could not compete. And #3 was Stanley Tucci's Taste.
Wow.
And I share that story all the time, not to say, oh, look at how great I am, but to tell people that when somebody is limiting you, they are limiting you. You have to believe deeper than their no that
Yes.
something is going to happen. And, they don't have to necessarily be on your team. And I always tell people, if your product needs work, then your product needs work, right? Like, we can all take constructive
Sure.
criticism, but whenever you know that you have something special and that you've worked your hardest on it and that you've gotten that input and that you've tightened it up and you spent 17 years of your life slaving away
Yes.
at this,
Yes.
right? And you have a feeling that something's going to work for it, like, you trust your gut. Like, that's your body, mind, and soul telling you that you are exactly where you're
Yes.
supposed to be and that it's going to work. And, I just knew, I always felt very special about this book, and not just because it's about my family, but I felt like there was so much dissension especially during that 2020, 2021 time, right? You had people on opposite ends of the
Yeah.
spectrum believing one thing, believing another thing. There's no middle ground. What On the Rocks was doing is it's not saying that we're all the same, but it's saying we can all be different, but we can all agree on certain things, and we could all
Yeah.
come together, and we can all get along. And your right doesn't have to be my wrong, like,
Right.
let's talk about the things that unify us as humans, not the things that are divisive. And I think that is kind of what made this book work at the time that it came out. Even though
Yeah.
it didn't make sense on paper, it made sense in my heart that it was going to work.
Well, I'm just so proud of you for sticking
Thank
with it.
you.
You want to talk about resilience. 17 years writing, and then
Yeah,
all of those rejections. It must have really felt surreal
it
to see that
certainly
Amazon
was. Yes.
ranking.
I thought it was a mistake, I pulled up the book and I thought, "You've gotta be kidding me," and now we're almost 7 months out from the release, and we're still consistently in Amazon's top 100, for white collar
Yeah.
crime, for culinary memoir. It's so cool, and it's awesome to hear from people because this has impacted people in very different ways,
Yeah.
and it's cool. Like, a lot of people, the title On the Rocks is actually a triple entendre.
Mm,
So On the Rocks obviously is a drink over ice, and my dad's place was also had a bar, so there was plenty of that going on. Could mean a unstable or shaky situation, right? When you're on the rocks.
mm.
And also the town of McKees Rocks, locals call it the Rocks.
Okay.
So what has happened is that people who are from this area are seeing the top of our book is the McKees Rocks Bridge, which is actually a mile-long bridge. It's one of the
Okay.
longest bridges in the world. Um, and they're buying it because they have that allegiance to the area, and they're getting the story on top of it. So in a way, this has also become a very nostalgic historic piece for people that grew up in Western Pennsylvania. It's an important part of Western Pennsylvania history.
Wow. Well, thank you, Maria, so much for
Thank
coming on
you.
and sharing your story with us. Like I said, I'm really admire your resilience, also just the overcoming the struggles and finding peace within and helping. You're such a helper.
Oh,
So
thank
I just
you.
really appreciate you sharing the story. Now, tell us if we're interested in getting the book. How can we find the book? And then
Sure.
also you didn't mention your tours. I know that you do tours.
I do.
So tell us where we can find the book. Also, tell us about the tours.
Yeah, so you can really find the book really wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble. You can also go to my website, mariacpalmer.com, and there's vendors everywhere. If it happens to not be at your favorite bookstore, it is distributed through Ingram, so they can order it. So it's everywhere. As far as the tour, oh my goodness, it's so much fun, and it's actually getting even juicier than whenever I had last spoke with you. So we do all the traditional book tour events. We do signings, we do library readings, we do a lot of virtual and live book clubs. I just did a virtual book club last week in Alpharetta, Georgia, a group of 10 women. So much fun. Awesome. Um, but the two new things that we've been doing a lot of all around the country, the first is cooking books. And these are experiential for those of you who either love to cook or love to want to know how to cook. These are for you. So it's a group of people. My max for this is like 35. But we cook family recipes from my family, many of which inspired prima donna food. So I do a ricotta gnocchi class with homemade marinara sauce. I bring some other bells and whistles, and we spend the first hour and a half cooking, and then the second hour and a half we sit down for a meal and a book discussion and a Q&A and some different photo ops and signings. My latest thing, which is super exciting, is we just established a partnership with Van Gora Countertops, which is a high-end countertop place in Western Pennsylvania, a little east of Pittsburgh. And so they're going to be partnering with us to do quarterly prima donna nights. So
Oh,
for people that have read the book and maybe they either didn't live in Pittsburgh during the 80s through the early 2000s, or maybe they were too young to remember, we're going to recreate the prima donna 4 times a year
oh
with
wow.
my dad as the host, and we're making all the old recipes. And they have a very open kitchen concept. So if you like to cook, you'd like this. But if you like to eat, you'd also like this. I call it kind of like the lazier man's cooking book because you're not
Okay.
working for your food.
Yeah.
It's being cooked for you. It's a 4-course meal. There's a 40-person maximum for it. And I do believe we haven't put the tickets on sale yet. It's the first one's going to be May 13th, right after Mother's Day. I do believe that that will be a hot ticket. It's going to be
Yeah.
a BYO. I think we nailed down the first menu. So we're going to have fried zucchini, which is a big staple in the book. It was a free appetizer that my dad would give away to kind of entice people to come back. Mancini's Bread is the bread company that has been in business for 100 years in Pittsburgh. So garlic toast with marinated red roasted peppers, chicken marsala, a spaghetti con sausage, which has loose hot sausage and red and green peppers and a red sauce. And then my mom makes this decadent frozen chocolate cheesecake, which almost
Oh, wow.
tastes like an ice cream cake with topped with pecans. So it's gonna be good. So if you're in
I
the
can't wait
Pittsburgh
to hear
area,
about it.
yeah,
If I
yeah,
get
but
up to the Pittsburgh area, I'll definitely try to time it to
yes,
be able to make one
yeah.
of those events.
Yeah, so and it's all on my if you go to my website under the events page, they're all there, and I do a majority of events in the Northeast, but I do have some stuff cooking up in California over the summer, which I'm excited about. And I was just in January, I was just in Florida. So I pretty much go wherever the wind takes me. So do reach out if you have an idea and I can accommodate it. I would love to.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Maria, for sharing this story. Like I said, such a triumph, and I'm so happy for you, and so
Thank
glad that
you.
the book is doing well. And thank
Thank
you
you.
all for joining us tonight for She Built It Boss Lady Chronicles. Maria dropped some serious gems for us, just in terms of the way that we can approach adversity, how we can overcome adversity, and then how we can find ourselves and our purpose on the other side. So I thank you for joining us this evening, and we will see you next week for another episode of She Built It Boss Lady Chronicles. Take care and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.